Welcome back. Hour number 2 of Spooky South Coast. Tim Weisberg here, along with the silent assassin Matt Costa, science advisor Matt Moniz, and Stephanie Burke, both out of the Spooky Studio tonight. I don't know exactly what Moniz is up to, but Stephanie is at her, what's the name of the event, do you remember? I don't remember. It's Spooky Thanksgiving or something like that. Yeah, they're trying to leech off our name.
Stealing the name.
So, but it's herself and Dustin Parry and Cody's there and Ashley and everybody, and we're here doing the show because
I hope they bring us a Thanksgiving sandwich.
That's all that I care about.
Because they do have a turkey dinner there.
I wanted to be here to do the show because we have a great guest, and we'll get right back into it with Dr. Andrea Kitta in just a moment. But I do want a turkey sandwich, so there's that too.
Right. There's nothing better than a Thanksgiving sandwich.
Right. Do you just real quickly? We have to talk about food at some point during the show,
right.
So we might as well do it now. Real quickly, what goes on your perfect Thanksgiving sandwich?
Do you want me to start with the base?
Yes.
Base is mashed potatoes.
Okay. On top of the bread.
Right.
Okay.
Then
what kind of bread, by the way?
Doesn't matter. White bread.
All right.
Whatever bread's laying around. Usually potatoes, peas, turkey, gravy, cranberry sauce on the other side. Stick it together.
So you go full out with the peas and everything. So
if there's butternut squash, then that goes in the middle too.
The butternut squash is the key.
It's got to go in the middle though.
So I go white bread. I go mayonnaise. You gotta have the mayonnaise on it.
Okay.
All right. Then I hit it with some stuffing.
Then I forgot the stuffing. Yeah, there's stuffing in there somewhere. Yeah.
I hit it with the stuffing. Then I hit it with the squash.
Mm-hmm.
Then I hit it because I like the squash to go between the turkey and the stuffing. Then the turkey. Then the cranberry sauce.
Mm-hmm.
And then more mayonnaise on the other piece of bread. That's it. That's all that I need.
Yeah.
And
it's a good sandwich.
If there's some more pearl onions, I like a few of those on the side.
Yeah. And it somehow tastes better at like 12:30 at night. Like
right.
Yeah, after Thanksgiving is done.
I mean, I haven't made Thanksgiving at my house ever. It's always been we've gone to somebody else's house, but we always make sure we take plenty of leftovers.
Right.
For the inevitable desire. Let's bring our guest, Dr. Andrea Kitta, back and ask her, Dr. Kitta, what's your perfect Thanksgiving sandwich if you were going to construct one?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not much of a sandwich person. I just go for.
Well, this has been a great interview. Again. Thanks for talking with us, but we only talk to sandwich people on this show.
That's it. I'm out now, right?
But but a sandwich is just like a good folklore story. Everybody's got their own take on it. Everybody's got their own way as long as the meat in the middle is the same, how you get to that meat is all up to you.
That's it. That's a very good analogy.
If it's one thing I can do, I can make up food analogies all day long. So we've been talking a bit in the first hour. We talked quite a bit about medicine and about your work in that regard. But also, a big part of what you deal in, as we mentioned before, is folklore, superstition, and the supernatural. And it's, I hate to ask you how long you've been doing this for, but was there a time in your career when the supernatural wasn't something that you felt comfortable or that was accepted being talked about in a classroom environment?
That's a really good question. Actually, when I first got started, I was always interested in the supernatural, but I was sort of told you get your job, get tenure, then you can do supernatural.
Right.
So and that was something I kind of, I followed a bit. I got asked at one point at my university, we want to do a new fun course. We wanted to have a really cool title. Do you have any ideas? And I was like, oh yeah, I want to teach a class called the Supernatural. And, of course that has, once we developed it, has become the most popular course there. So, but yeah, there's that tension there too. And I've actually had people discredit my work with medicine because I also do the supernatural, which I think is kind of hilarious.
Yeah, we were talking about that at the beginning of the show about the person that Donald Trump nominated.
Yeah.
I mean, what's I don't understand why that should matter, why that should take away. I actually got into an argument. I used to do a Saturday morning general talk show here on the station. And I got into it one day with a call. Actually, my last show, I got into it with a caller who said, that I wasn't entitled to have my opinions on politics or the economy or anything like that because I'm a ghost hunter.
Yeah, and I think that is very problematic, and it's something we actually talk about a lot in folklore. We talk about the traditions of belief and disbelief, which is this idea from David Hufford, this whole sort of concept that just as there's traditional things to believe in, there's traditional things to disbelieve in, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we're totally fine in North American culture, generally speaking, that we're fine with somebody to, like, if you have a belief in a deity, that's not too bad, right? We're pretty cool with that. And it's like, then there's like these gray areas where, like, do you believe in, like, supernatural creatures like angels? Like, angels more okay maybe than ghosts for some people. But then, like, if we cross into, like, Jesus is having breakfast with me, now we're into like a whole different area, right? So it's like, it's fine to believe in Jesus, but not if he's having breakfast with you. So, there's all these lines that we draw, and they're really arbitrary. If we're going to really think about what is a rational belief, we don't really decide things based on that. We decide more on the fact that they're something that we've always believed in, and we haven't always believed in them. So it isn't the supernatural is an arbitrary sort of line that we've decided is something that we're not supposed to believe in.
And I think part of the problem, and I'm sure that you have delved into this deeper than I have, but one of the things that I've realized is that when you look at American history, we're only a couple of 100 years old. We've got a variety of different cultures. So if you go to other countries where they have a longer history with their people, and B, more of a concentration of one certain kind of people and belief set, it's these traditions can take hold there a little bit easier. Here in America, it's almost like it's a culture shock of all of these amalgamations of different belief systems and different supernatural beliefs and everything kind of all thrown together, and we expect it all to coexist.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the, to go back to something else David Hufford said, was he had this really succinct way of talking about belief, and I thought it's just so beautiful and perfect. But he said, what I know, but what you only believe. I thought, that's like perfect. That's exactly how we approach other people's beliefs, right? The things that we believe we're totally sure about. But when we talk about other people's beliefs, we think of them as being, sort of arbitrary or not as deeply felt as our own belief. And that's, of course, simply not true. Everybody, the way we process belief and the way we think about belief, it's really complicated. And it's not just something you just wake up one day and decide to believe in something. Like, it's a long process. People have experiences. They have, they hear stories. They have all this sort of amalgamation of information, and then they make a decision about whether or not to believe that. And that changes throughout life. But we tend to treat it as this thing that is irrational and is illogical, when in actuality there's a lot of reason and logic applied to belief. It's, but we also kind of tend to think of the words reason and logic as being also synonymous with correct. No, it's not always correct, but there is reason and logic behind it.
Well, I also think we don't do ourselves any favors with the way that we introduce these stories to people, because, we're going to tell a lot of stories of folklore and fairy tales and things of that nature to young kids. And then at the same time, we're also telling them that none of this stuff is real. So you're giving them these stories that they don't have the opportunity to analyze, because you're telling them right from the beginning, it's just a good story and that's it.
Yeah, and that's so problematic when we think about even things like trust. We're not really building up a really good system of trust with children if we tell them all these stories and then tell them later that we were lying to them.
Right.
So, that's a really problematic sort of system to set up.
I mean,
there's so many things that we're taught as children and then taught later on that they're not true.
One of the first things that your parents do is start lying to you. They lie to you about the Tooth Fairy, the Easter Bunny, and Santa Claus. So automatically, I'll never forget, this story of my son when, he found out that there was no Santa Claus. He was very upset, because he said, all those years I thought it was somebody else that was giving me those gifts, when actually I should have been thanking my parents. And it's like, and some people, that's the way that they take it. It's, you're lying to them, and now they're like, well, can I trust you about any of this stuff that you've told me now over the years?
Yeah, exactly.
Although it's I hate to crap on the magic, but it still astounds me that any kid buys into that story anymore, really, when you look at it, because you're like, it doesn't really make any sense at all.
No, but, but they believe it because they trust the parents, right?
Right. and we're just abusing that
so-
trust as parents.
Yeah, so we're really kind of setting up a really bad system when we think about it that way.
That's all right though, because they end up becoming smarter than us anyway, and they get the last word in the end. But a lot of these, these stories that we tell in this country have come from Europe. We brought a lot of our folklore over from there, but we've also created some of our own uniquely American folklore as well. What would you say is probably the, if you're going to take a look at all the different all the archetypes of stories, is there one thematic element that has kind of traveled across all cultures? I mean, I know the story of the hero is something that has transcended pretty much through every generation, especially the tragic hero.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't like to think too much about. So I have one problem with archetype. I'll just say that right off the bat, and I think some folklorists will agree with me and some won't. My personal opinion is that context really matters. So when we think about like these stories that sort of transcend time, we also have to think about the context of those stories, right? So like a lot of people always point to like something like Cinderella. So like almost every culture has a story about Cinderella, right? Or they at least have a story about a girl who is sort of like put to a lower position in her family and forced to work, and then later on her actual position is sort of realized, and good things happen to her. And I mean, yes, that's true. That's a pretty common type of story. But the context of it is so different, right, in every different culture. So there's all these different versions of that story, and all those little details actually really matter a lot. So it could be anything from, was it her mother or her stepmother? Was it her father dies or he doesn't die? What kind of shoe is it? There's so many other little things other than that, other than those sort of motifs in it, that really matter. Like, what is the cultural situation that she grew up in? What is, where is the, like the lines of lineage and all that kind of stuff. There's so many complicated things there. But I do think there are things that we understand as human beings. Like there are things too that are kind of unique about us, but there's also things that we have in common, right? We understand general feelings like betrayal, love, that kind of stuff. And then those stories, we kind of refer to it in folklore as polygenesis. More than one person can come up with some of these stories. So it makes sense. It's not like there's ever one single story that all these things kind of come from.
Right.
But yeah, there's so many things when we think about so many stories that have some similarities across the way. And then just things that stick around for a really long time. I always think of one of the oldest urban legends that we know about is the vanishing hitchhiker legend, which is a pretty common story about, usually the modern versions involve someone picking up a hitchhiker and then finding out kind of through the night, either she disappears from the back seat of the car, she leaves the sweater behind, something like that happens, and the person finds out that she died like 10 years ago that very night. And we actually know of versions of that go all the way back to people riding on horseback, people being in carriages. And there's even a story, too, that's even older that goes to two people walking next to each other. The horseback one's actually one of the best ones because this guy actually picks up this woman alongside of the road, puts her in front of him on the horse. She gets heavier as the night goes on, and when he comes to the town in the morning, he realizes that there's actually a corpse in front of him.
Wow!
I
like that one.
Story.
Oh, that's
why I have to tell it.
That's way better than the Dickie Lee song, where it's just, I found a sweater on her grave, And
yeah, right. It's so much better than a sweater on a grave.
AKA the Growing Pains episode for anybody, the Halloween Growing Pains episode for anybody that remembers that. But we have our own hitchhiker story here, where we are on the south coast of Massachusetts. We have our red-headed hitchhiker to Route 44, and that same story is told up and down every road. It's not anything that. Although what's interesting is, I look at it the same way you do, where it's a story, and there's really no way to kind of trace it back to any kernel of truth, except for the fact that we do a stage show called An Evening of Ghost Stories and New England Legends, where myself and some of my friends, we tell these ghost stories in front of these giant photos displayed on a big screen behind us, and it's like a ghost tour on stage. And so I get up there the first time, and I tell the story of the red-headed hitchhiker of Route 44, and a guy comes up to me after the show and starts talking to me and says, you mentioned in that there's no record of anything ever happening on that part of the road or anything, but my brother's a cop, and he starts telling me the whole story of who this redheaded hitchhiker probably is and where that ghost story came about, which kind of blew my mind because I'm like, but no, this is just a story that's told everywhere. How can there be this one true person that this one traces back to? But it just goes to show that maybe the real life tragic event happens and the urban legend just builds up around it.
Absolutely, yeah. And I mean, that's entirely possible with a lot of these, because some of them are stories where something like that could happen. I mean, that's that believable element of them. There's, they sound like something that could absolutely happen.
Or maybe, something just happens, the story exists and something else happens that kind of just fits into it. Because one of the things that I was talking about with somebody recently when it comes to folklore and stories that are passed down is the fact that, well, if these stories are just stories, their staying power in them is that we don't change the way that we tell them. That people are still telling, like you mentioned, Cinderella or Snow White or any of these Grimm's fairy tales. They're still telling them the same way, hundreds of years later, but they're not. We may still tell the original version, but we're also forever, modernizing them, adapting them, coming up with newer, more modern versions of these stories, ethnic versions of these stories. We always morph these stories into something else.
Yeah, we change them all the time. And we adapt them, you're right, to different situations, to different, we may, like, there's a new Cinderella movie, like, every couple of years, right? Or we see that motif, especially in children's shows and a lot of other places, because, in part, a lot of these stories get used and reused, not only because they speak to us on a lot of different levels, but we also have to remember they're also free.
Right, that's the other thing. They're in the public domain, so there's no rights involved with it.
Yeah, you don't have to worry about the rights to them. So, but there is something, and I think that's, part of good storytelling is that you do have to really kind of attach to something the audience already knows and then build on that. And that's what these stories do. These are stories that sound familiar to us. We've heard something like them. So when we hear them again, they sound vaguely familiar, but not so familiar that we're bored with them,
So before we get into Slenderman, I want to talk about some of the other urban legends that have kind of gripped people in recent years. One of them being, and this one comes up a lot, and we can say whether or not it's true paranormal research or just folklore storytelling or urban legend or what have you, but the black-eyed kids have become a big story that a lot of people have shared, and I assume that you've had a lot of people share with you accounts of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I've heard these stories. I would say that and shadow people are the two probably most common things I hear, at least from my students. And those have been cycled through a few times now. So, I mean, we refer to them as legend cycles sometimes, where, certain stories actually kind of come back into popularity after a certain period of time. And we know that these things will kind of drop out for a while and they'll come back up. So, yeah, we've been hearing these on and off. And I think, especially in the case of the black-eyed children, they're so uncanny. They're so creepy because, children, generally speaking, can be creepy.
Yes, I agree.
For lack of better terms. But,
I hate to say that, but I agree.
They say odd things. They perceive things we don't, right? So they can be kind of creepy. So this idea, especially with the eyes, because that is something that we, the humanness of the eye of eyes, especially in the case, obviously, of humans, that really speaks to us. So to have the eyes be different is part of what makes it so uncomfortable and so uncanny.
Well, you mentioned legend cycles. What are some of the things that we've seen come in a cyclical nature?
There's so many of them. We've actually, the creepy clown has been a legend cycle more recently. So we've seen it cycle through in a couple of different places. There was a legend cycle, actually, I think it was in 2014 in France, of creepy clowns. Then we had the 2016 sort of legend cycle of creepy clowns, and then, of course, with it this year. But we didn't have the same one that kind of happened, the previous year. But that's one that's kind of cycled through. We see, I see it all the time with vaccines, specifically, especially the flu vaccines. We get a legend cycle every flu season about the vaccine and whether or not it's effective and, if it gives you the flu and stuff like that. So we'll see ones like that are a little bit more annual, but then there'll be other ones that, if there's a big disaster, there'll be a legend cycle that kind of comes up where you'll hear these stories about Bibles that didn't burn or, something falls into the shape of a cross or someone is miraculously saved by a Bible or a flask or some other sort of object. So those kind of stories kind of cycle back in too, and we have like major tragedies too.
So it's very interesting that you can see the patterns to these things, that a lot of what just seems as general weirdness to a lot of us is actually cyclical in nature.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Is there anything that we're kind of in the midst of now that that's caught your attention?
Right now, I think we're so caught up into what is actually happening in the world. we haven't had as much time for legends, but we certainly do still see them all the time. There's actually, if anybody is interested, there's a great Facebook group with the International Society for Contemporary Legend Research, and people probably post 20 times a day on that about different legends that they're seeing reemerge. Legends that are mentioned in the news or in other places. So that's a great place to kind of look for them and see like what people are kind of talking about. And we'll see stuff come up just with Halloween coming around. We saw the legend cycle of people poisoning children's Halloween candy or giving children drugs.
Well,
looking like candy in some sort of way. So that was like a pretty good legend cycle that comes up usually around Halloween every year.
That I can tell you who made up that legend. That was my grandfather making that up so he could take all of my candy back when I was a kid.
That's what I always thought as a kid too.
It's like it was the ones. I could always tell which ones were going to have the poison in them because they were always the ones that he was buying the rest of the year, and would always have in the dish next to his chair. So I knew like if I had a Three Musketeers, it was probably poison. And but for some reason the poison doesn't work on adults. It just works on kids. Something to do with our genetic makeup, I guess. Well, we have a call on the line here, so let's take that call. Good evening. You're on Spooky South Coast with Dr. Kitta. How are you?
Well, hey Tim, this is Cameron Pasha from California calling in.
Hey, how you doing?
I'm well. I'm really enjoying tonight's podcast, and Professor, I really want to thank you for speaking. I know how in the academic world a lot of the supernatural stuff that you're talking about is seen as very strange. So thank you for sharing this really wonderful perspective. So the question I have is, I actually would love to hear about your thoughts on the Bigfoot phenomenon, because my opinion is that is the most basic North American folklore story, because it goes back to Native Americans. I work in the Hollywood industry, and people often think it's crazy that I believe in things like Bigfoot. But I'm like, do you doubt hundreds of Native tribes and their consistent stories that go back centuries and that are still alive today? So I'd love to get your perspective on the phenomenon as folklore and what it means.
All right, were we able to hear the question, Dr. Kitta?
Oh, yeah, actually, I only caught parts of that.
Okay,
sorry.
Sometimes
cutting out a little bit.
Sometimes the phones don't really match up well, but the question was about Bigfoot as American folklore, particularly with the Native American tribes.
Absolutely. And I will fully admit that is not my specialty, so I don't know a ton about Bigfoot. There are a lot of other people that know much, much more than I do. But that has been one that's been going around for a really long period of time. There's something, whenever I hear a story that is sticks around like that, there's always something to it, right? And it might be that it is interesting, or it really speaks to our relationship with the environment, or it really speaks to something else, or that it is simply, it's something that people have seen and have passed it on. We can't kind of, discount that people have had experiences. So it's one of those things that if something as enduring as that, there's got to be something there, right? There has to be something that people are really attaching to. So I don't discount any of that kind of stuff. I think it can be, really important to know a little bit more about. And I apologize, it's not my area of expertise. I know so many more people that are more experts in this than myself. But, I think there's something there. And it's such a, in some ways it is a uniquely American story. In other ways it's not, because we have stories about Yetis and other ones from across the globe. But there is something about that notion of, especially things that look human-ish that aren't exactly human. There's something there that we really attach to in some sort of way. There's, kind of go back to that word uncanny. There's something really uncanny about them. And I think that's part of the reason why we tell these stories so often, is because it's just something that we really attach to.
All right. Well, thank you very much for the call, Cameron.
Thank you. Talk to you soon.
We'll see you soon. And that is one of the things, you mentioned the fact that humanistic qualities or something that we tend to look for in a lot of these stories. One of those stories is the idea of the Jersey Devil. Has there been a lot of stories about that recently? Because I can't get into things that I'm not given permission to talk about on the air, but there's somebody who's having an experience where something might be similar to that. And is that something that pops up now and again, the idea of this Jersey Devil type phenomenon?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that's a really common, especially for the Pine Barrens in New Jersey. You hear more, of course, people from that area talking about it. But yeah, that one kind of cycles through too, and sort of the beliefs about it. But it's one of the ones that if you ask someone, tell me a story, about a supernatural creature, tell me a story about a place, they're going to come up with the Jersey Devil, because that is one that is really permeated through our culture in a lot of different ways. And I think it is that idea that it is, in part, I guess it's partially kind of, it's not really human, but it kind of is human. And the whole, notion of the woman who's giving birth and saying, for a 13th child, and that the devil may take it, or, it's the devil's child, along those lines. And I think that's another thing that we really, a lot of our stories do involve things like the nature of good and evil. And that's certainly one that kind of ties into that.
So my other co-host, Matt Moniz, is not here either. He is a ufologist. He's somebody who has worked very closely with abductee cases, says he's been abducted himself. One thing that I want to ask you, because I love to ask this question, and it really pisses Moniz off, so he's not here to argue it, is the idea of aliens, UFOs. Are these just modern versions of the boogeyman? Are these does our boogeyman not just change with time and with technology, that we have to find something else to be afraid of?
That's a really interesting question, because I think yes and no.
Okay.
So I think we've had this idea of, especially aliens, of people coming from other planets for a really, really long period of time. And I don't think anything has changed about that. But I think sometimes other stories get melded into that and kind of blended in. Because one of the things I'm kind of interested in, just because it's something I talk about a lot and something I teach a lot, is sleep paralysis. And the idea of, especially the old hag, especially in the Newfoundland tradition, where there is literally something sitting on your chest. And the fact that a lot of people have the perception that they see something when this incident happens, which has some biomedical explanation but is not entirely explained by biomedicine. But a lot of times, too, I hear that in combination with abduction narratives, right? Or I hear it in combination with a UFO story. So I think those two things were kind of separate traditions for a while, but now they're kind of starting to blend together into one, where it's not just a witch that's sitting on your chest, or it's a demon, or it's a black dog or cat or anything like, or some sort of supernatural entity, but that it is an alien that's doing it. So I think there is some blending of that tradition. And some people might argue with me and say, well, maybe it was always aliens, and, it was the older tradition to believe that it was any of those other things.
Yeah, maybe that's what the aliens were projecting, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's quite possible that if there is some mind control element to this, maybe they're the ones that are just kind of making it whatever society believes in at that time.
Exactly. Yeah. So there's that argument as well. So, it is, it's interesting to think about, because we do change slightly about what we think is scary over time. But we still kind of come back to the same larger notions of, kids are always creepy. Things that look like us but aren't us are always creepy, and that's, and a lot of times that's how aliens are portrayed, right? You have the Greys that are sort of humanoid in some sort of way, but they look like us, but they don't.
And one of the things that looks like us but isn't, of course, is Slenderman, which is something that I have never seen something take off like this, in a way where we know from the outset that it's not real, but yet we've made it real.
Yeah, absolutely. And that, I think, that was surprising for a lot of us. Even for folklorists who are used to seeing things kind of take off, we're like, wow, why is this so popular? Why this thing in particular? And I think that was really fascinating for us to watch, because we know it started on the Something Awful forum in 2009. We know that, it has this sort of trajectory. We know all of the video games. We know the YouTube channels. We know, all the stuff that's kind of come through. But that hasn't stopped people's belief, especially when it came to doing the Photoshop, which was really interesting, too, to see how many different ways people manipulated photos to make it look like Slenderman was in them. And that was always so cool because it was sort of a weird, where's Waldo kind of thing sometimes, where
Right.
someone would post a picture online and you'd be like, I can't find Slenderman. Where is he? But yeah, it was so amazing to see how that took off. And it may have died out, generally speaking, or for a lot of people, they didn't even know it existed until, of course, the stabbings that happened. And that kind of, brought a resurgence of at least more people sort of knowing about it. So I felt like there was a sort of a group of people who knew about it, and then it got, sort of more widespread because of the stabbings. But yeah, that was so interesting to see how people really connected with it, and that they would see these Photoshops, especially some of the Photoshops of the woodcuts, that made it look a lot older than what it really was. So it kind of became this thing of, well, are we just talking about it now? Is it, something that we forgot about, but we've actually used to know in the past, and now it's sort of resurged. And that was really kind of fascinating to see people talk about that. And even the people who accepted the fact that it was created in 2009, there was also sort of that belief that it became what was, frequently called a tulpa or an egregor or a thought form, that it was something that we, by talking about it, by acknowledging it, brought into existence, which is also a really interesting concept.
And I think that's a big part of this is the fact that we are kind of willing it into existence. For example, here in the South Coast of Massachusetts, we have the Native American Pukwudgies, which were something that the natives believed in hundreds of years ago. And then there's all these years where you could almost say, okay, maybe there wasn't a lot of sightings of them or a lot of reported sightings of them. But now that the term has come back into fashion, now all of a sudden we're seeing more sightings of these, almost because we're willing them into existence by talking about them. And I think that does happen with these things.
Yeah, it's really this interesting idea. Folklore sometimes talk about the cultural source hypothesis and the experiential source hypothesis. And for a long time, a lot of people really believed that we had supernatural experiences because we had stories. So we'd hear the story, and then, we'd get scared in the middle of the night. We'd think we saw something, but it was because of the story. But actually, people have experiences, right? And sometimes they don't know the stories. This is really common with sleep paralysis. So people will have, sleep paralysis episodes where they wake up in the middle of the night, they're unable to move. Sometimes they see something, and they won't tell anybody about it for years. But then they later on find out that there's all these stories about this. And for a lot of people, that actually makes them feel a lot better because they realize it's not just them, they're not going crazy. But that it's actually the experience that starts before the story. So it does kind of get into that question of, in some ways, which came first. And of course, in some cases, it's both. Sometimes, you hear about this stuff and then you have the experience. But other times, the experience comes first without even knowing anything about it. Mm-hmm. And I think that's an interesting way to think about it, instead of just sort of blaming stories on it, thinking of it as, well, people had the experience and that's where the stories came from.
I did have somebody mention to me once before when the stabbings took place and Slenderman was kind of in the news for all of that. And I work in news, so people are constantly, when news stories come up about weird stuff, they're always asking me what I think about it. And so somebody at the newspaper where I worked asked me, is this the first time that you can remember where somebody's superstition or belief in the supernatural led them to do something like this? And I was like, well, no, there was a little something that happened in Salem in 1692 that was probably a little bit more egregious than this, but it has been something that people have taken these beliefs to an extreme and actually done harm to other people over them.
Absolutely. And I mean, we even saw in the late 70s and the 80s the satanic panics, where we were blaming kids, we were blaming people, we were actually pinning murders on people for no other reason than, they were the goth kids in town, right? So, and it's a sort of lower level, for lack of better terms, witch hunt. But yeah, I mean, we fall into this. We like to think of these things too, I think sometimes as, that's, part of this old thinking process. We don't think like that anymore. It's like, no, we still do. And I mean, we've certainly done it in even more recent years. I mean, a lot of our fear of Muslims, of people, we get all these stories. I was kind of talking earlier about 9/11 stories, and it's the same thing with the whole story about seeing people celebrate after 9/11 that were Muslim or were from an area that people perceived as being part of 9/11. We still see that terror and that fear where people get visually upset when they see someone that they perceive as being from that culture. So it's a different kind of witch hunt. Now, are we burning, people? Well, of course, they didn't really burn that many people in Salem, but, we're hanging people for it? Not yet.
Right.
So,
and even then,
we don't.
Even then, the hangings
something that's happened in the past. It's something currently happening too, right? So, I think we can be kind of judgy about this stuff and think, it happened then, it doesn't happen anymore. Well, no, it still happens all the time. These girls having this experience, it got into the news, it became very popular, but it's not like this is the first time something like this has happened.
Especially where we're willing to mold what's happening into fitting our narrative of it. So, like you mentioned, the Satanic Panic, and I remember being a young person and seeing MTV news reports of it was a Judas Priest album that they were saying push somebody into either killing somebody else or killing themselves or what have you. And because when they played the record backward, you could hear the phrase, "Hey mom, my chair is broken." So obviously that meant some sort of satanic code to people that they're, I'm like, but what does that mean? "Hey mom, my chair is broken." Just because that's what you think that you're hearing when you play it backwards doesn't mean that it drove anybody to do anything, anything egregious like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and it was just the same as, people used to say the Paul is dead thing if you play
right.
the Beatles albums backwards, right? All of this stuff is, it just keeps kind of cycling through. But, yeah, sometimes people read something more into it. I actually remember at one point, too, where they were banning peace signs because they said they were actually just stylized inverted crosses. This is like part of the Satanic Panic. I think people tend to overreact. And actually the whole Halloween candy thing we were just talking about, too, is all a part of that. This notion that, Satanists were going to poison your children's Halloween candy. And we can't celebrate Halloween anymore because it's a Satanist holiday, The
best meme that I saw this Halloween was somebody had posted up, make sure you check all your kids' candy. You never know what you're going to find. And it was like a Milky Way broken open with like a 9mm handgun in the middle of it. It actually made me laugh out loud. I was like, all right, that's pretty good.
That is good.
All right, we do have a call on the line. Again, if anybody wants to call in with any questions for our guest, Dr. Kitta, 508-996-0500, 877-996-1420. Good evening. You're next on Spooky South Coast. How are you?
How you doing?
Good. Do you have a question for Dr. Kitta?
No, well, you mentioned pug wedgies.
Yes.
Yeah, well, a pug wedgie is a deformed bush hog. Now, I've seen them at the golf course, and I see they come from the second hole in, and they're a bush hog that has a deformed face.
So you've seen them on the golf course?
Oh yeah, at the whale. Yep, pug wedgies.
So
they're a bush hog. I think they probably come out of the Freetown State Forest or through a sonnet down to that valley there. What do they call that? The Pascamanchik Valley, where there's some water behind the second hole at the whale. Whale City.
But what about all the supernatural stories that are attached to these things?
Well, I've seen it jump a chain link fence.
That's pretty.
Disappear, take right off and disappear. Jump the chain link fence.
I mean, the people are still
more than a bush hog that has a deformed face.
Oh, see, I've heard them described as everything from little tiny versions of Native Americans to, something that looks like out of the movie Critters. That, there's all these different.
Pug wedgies are deformed bush hog.
All right,
okay, have a good one.
You too. If you ever see one, let me know so we can go out there and capture it.
I told you, they're out there.
But let me know, like, on a specific night when you see them. We'll go out there and we'll catch them.
They chase the rabbits. See you later.
All right, see ya. I will definitely put on a rabbit costume if it will draw one out. He's mentioned that to us before that he's seen the puckwudgies, but I've never gone out there at night. Maybe I really should.
Yeah, maybe.
One of my favorites. See, working in the newsroom here, we get a lot of interesting stuff over the scanner, and one of my favorite stories was a couple of months ago, there were some kids in Fall River that were trapped on a golf course after hours, and the police were trying to tell them to get off the golf course, but they refused to leave because the kids kept saying that they saw coyotes everywhere, that every time they tried to leave the golf course, there was coyotes blocking their way from getting off the golf course. So the police are yelling at them with the bullhorn, and they're like screaming back to them, but there's coyotes! But there were no coyotes. They were just high. That's what the cop said on the scanner anyway. Like, yeah, there's no coyotes. These kids are just smoking something. So, but...
Oh, that's funny.
But, I mean, you know, that is what happens, though, is that stories can... Oh, we have another call coming in. Stories can pop up like that where all of a sudden it just takes one little, like the caller was mentioning about puckwudgies being something with a deformity, a deformed bush hog. It just takes one little weird thing like that to kind of kick off an entire wealth of stories of high strangeness.
Mm-hmm.
Like the Dover Demon, that story, I don't know if you're familiar with that. That's a kind of a Massachusetts legend, but a lot of people thought that was, you know, the explanation they gave for it was a deformed baby moose. You know, but
interesting.
Deformed baby mooses don't climb up rock walls. But, you know, hey, whatever. Let's take this other call here. Good evening. You're on Spooky South Coast with Dr. Kitta. How are you?
Oh, hi, I'm doing fine. This is Eric.
Hello.
Excuse me. I'm Professor Eric in live chat.
Hey, nice to hear from you.
I think that my field and Dr. Kitta's probably overlap a good bit. And since we're covering the paranormal tonight almost from A to Z, you know, one thought I often have is that when we come across something we don't understand, you know, we know that at least neurologically, our brains don't like ambiguity. So, you know, if we have to, we sort of fill in the blanks. It's kind of a gestalt sort of thing. We just, you know, we do our best to connect the dots so that we have something and we can say, okay, now I understand it. And I'm wondering if you have to take that into consideration when you're doing your research, you're doing writing, interviewing people. Is that in the back of your mind?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, it absolutely is. The good part for me, I guess, the solution to this for me is a lot of my work. So I'm interested in why people tell the stories they tell, but I actually am not interested in literal truth, which is kind of weird to say. So even if somebody is lying to me, or even if they're experiencing something and they think that it's one thing and it might be actually like psychologically something else, they're still doing it within the context of the tradition. So they still understand, you know, how to tell a good story. They still understand what parts are going to work and what don't work. So even in the situations where maybe I'm not getting the whole story, I'm still getting something that's culturally relevant. So it's still, from that perspective, it's still interesting to me. On a personal level, though, there are definitely times where I have my own sort of gut reaction where I'm like, okay, yeah, I don't know if I believe this entirely, or I think this person is messing with me, or, you know, maybe it was something else. And that certainly happens to me, though, as a researcher, too.
Or maybe parts of it, you know, seem cogent to what you're doing, and then the other parts, because, you know, when I do counseling and when I'm working with students, there are times I feel like, you know, these pieces make sense, and the other pieces I think you didn't have. You had a blank space there, and you needed to fill in the blank, and then that's how you completed your story.
Absolutely, and I think a lot of times we use terminology that we understand as a way of describing something that's like something else. And sometimes like turns into exactly like, you know what I mean? So, you know, sometimes when people are describing things, they'll say like, well, it was like this, but then that slowly kind of morphs into that as well.
Okay. Thank you very much.
And thank you for the call, Eric.
Yeah, thank you.
Great to hear a voice from the chat room there. And again, we highly encourage everybody to call in with questions during the show each week. But we always have a great conversation going on in the chat room. One of the great things, Dr. Kitta, you have to say is that with the proliferation now of, you know, podcasts with people talking, you know, this is folklore, and research into these stories is something that is very popular. on the internet and is very popular with podcasters, with YouTubers. There's a lot of ways out there to get this information out that people are starting to talk about this stuff. And I don't mean just sharing the stories. I mean analyzing the stories and breaking them down and getting into the nuts and bolts of the whys.
Absolutely. And I think as folklorists, we love that. We love that people are getting engaged with us and that we can have these conversations. Because, we want to talk to people about this stuff. And we're the kind of, I guess we're the kind of academics where we're like, hey, come talk to us about it. Come tell us your stories. Come take a class with us and learn more. And that happens all the time. I get people in my classes that are ghost hunters or who are people that are just interested. And I get skeptics, I get believers. And we welcome all of those people to come and talk about this. It's great that we're having these conversations.
Absolutely. Now, where can people find more of your work and keep in touch with you and follow along with everything that you do?
Oh, well, you can follow me personally on Twitter. I do tweet sometimes. I also, I'm on several podcasts, actually on and off lately. But also the American Folklore Society is a great it's a great resource. We're always open to talking to different people. There's also the International Society for Contemporary Legend Research. We love to talk to people. We have really small conferences where people can come and listen or just be a part of things or even present themselves. So we'd love to have more people come out and be engaged.
Well, we're still going to make sure that we have you back on the show because this has been a great discussion, and it was only the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more we can get in depth, and please keep us up to date with anything that you're working on that you think would be interesting for our audience.
Absolutely. Thanks so much again for having me. All
right. Thank you for coming on, and have a good Thanksgiving.
Okay, you too.
Take care. That is our guest, Dr. Andrea Kitta. Again, you can follow along with her online. We tweeted out some stuff from her earlier today, so you can follow along with her on Twitter as well. Matt, I think that what I want more than anything right now is I want a good story, a good
right.
piece of folklore to sit down and read for the rest of the night, and a giant Thanksgiving sandwich.
I agree.
That's all.
Does Sonic have Thanksgiving sandwiches?
They do not. As great as the
do they have a Thanksgiving sandwich shake?
They probably do. As great as the conversation was, like in the back of my mind, all I'm thinking of the whole time is a Thanksgiving sandwich too.
Right.
But yes, you had Sonic for the first time last week, and you enjoyed it.
It was fabulous. Yeah.
Yeah,
we didn't experience the car service, but
no,
we got roller service
at our table.
So
there's certainly, and I just became a member of the International Society for Contemporary Legend Research on Facebook. I just got approved, so the notice just came up.
Cool.
So yes, no, there's no Thanksgiving Sonic shake, but there's Thanksgiving pizzas at places. Did you ever notice that? Places are doing Thanksgiving pizzas, with stuffing and turkey and stuff on.
That should be really good.
Yeah, I'm iffy.
Yeah,
I'm iffy on it, but
is it the cheese or?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure how it's all going to work.
Cranberry sauce.
That's what I was thinking. There must be at least a mixture of cranberry with it, or gravy. It could be gravy. Would that work? I don't know. When we have a bunch of Thanksgiving leftovers, this is all stuff that we'll try.
Right.
So if only we were still cooks, we could try it not on our own dimes. But since that's no longer the case, we'll have to pay for it. All right, so we will be back next week with another edition of Spooky South Coast. I think next week we'll be talking about Lizzie Borden, so something that we haven't talked about for a while. So you can tune in next Saturday night at 10 p.m. Eastern Time, and of course, streaming live on Spooky TV at SpookySouthCoast.com, as well as here on WBSM. And thank you to everybody who listens to us on the Dark Matter Radio Network as well. Truly honored to be a part of Art Bell's Dark Matter Radio Network. So however you get in touch with us, however you listen to the show, we'll see you next week, and we want you all to stay spooktacular.